Hi, thank you so much for joining me once again in the Louie file as we continue in our study through Romans 5 through 8. Today we are right around verse 15 in chapter 8. So once again, if you would like to back up and find the other videos, that would be great to get the fuller context. But today we're going to start Romans 8 verse 15. Actually, I wasn't sure how I was going to take this on, if I was going to read several or just stick with the one verse, but I think I'm just going to do this one verse and we'll move on if we have time. Romans 8 verse 15 says, "For you have not received a spirit of slavery or bondage," depending on your translation, "leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father." Wow. So, right away, I noticed that in this verse there are two spirits mentioned. There's a spirit of slavery or bondage that leads to fear, and then there's the spirit of adoption that leads to us crying out, Abba, Father. Now, just by way of a quick look back, in Romans 5 we read where we all start out in Adam and his transgression. So we find ourselves in a flesh-minded, sinful state. Because of his one act of disobedience, we're all going to die. But the good news is through the one act of obedience, the righteous behavior of Jesus Christ, the last Adam, by way of the cross, he can make us right. He can justify us, and he can clarify or clear up the transgression. And then in Romans 6, Paul tells us how that takes place. And it takes place because God himself has crucified us with Christ. He has taken what and who we were in the old Adam and placed us into Christ, the new man, the last Adam, crucified us, buried us, and raised us now, joined to this new last Adam, to walk in a brand new life, setting us free from sin. Now, I would definitely advise go back and look at those studies that I did in Romans 6 to clarify all of this more if you've missed that. But ultimately, just to get to the point here, Romans 6 eventually does say to us that we either are a slave to sin or a slave to righteousness. So, Romans 8:15 says we have not received one spirit, but we have in fact received the other. So, we have a slave master and a righteous master. Here we have a spirit of bondage, and then we also have the spirit of adoption as sons. So in Romans 6, Paul says we transfer through the cross from a slave to sin to a slave of righteousness. And I'm not saying that isn't true, but as we progressed after that, we saw in Romans 7 another amazing analogy of a husband and wife, and how we in fact have died to the law, and that we walk in this new spirit. We don't walk after the flesh in some deceived way of believing that we're independently able to obey God and do what he commands. I mean, we really can't obey him. Not as a flesh being, there's no way, and really even as a spirit being, because ultimately Christ himself is the one who condemned sin in the flesh, and God sent him in the likeness of sinful flesh to condemn sin in the flesh, so that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled or met in us who walk after the Spirit. So Christ is really the one who is fulfilling these commands as we by faith trust him to do so. He transforms us from the inside out, and then we're just carried along by his Spirit. So in Romans 8 here he says we didn't receive that spirit of bondage again. That's not the one that we have as a Christ follower, as a Christian, as a believer, as one in whom this spirit dwells. It's not the spirit of bondage to slavery and that leads to fear. That's not the spirit we have, and that's good news. But you have received the spirit of adoption as sons. Okay, so I'd like to just camp out here for a second. Obviously, there are two masters, and we're the slave. In Romans 7, there are two husbands, and we are illustrated as the wife. Here in Romans 8, there are two spirits, And we have received one or the other. Now, this leads me to some of my favorite verses in the book of 1 John, if you want to turn with me there. In 1 John 4, starting in verse 4 through 6, it says, "You are from God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. They are from the world, therefore they speak as from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. He who knows God listens to us. He who is not from God does not listen to us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error." Wow, so there it is in 1 John 4, the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. So in Romans 8:15, the Apostle Paul says it's the spirit of bondage or slavery, or the spirit of adoption. I think it's safe to say he's talking about the same things that 1 John is telling us. So rather than having a spirit in us that is leading to enslavement again, wow, we have a spirit in us that leads to us crying out, "Abba, Father." But what does this word adoption mean here? The spirit of adoption. Well, if you look into this a little bit, you'll undoubtedly be amazed, as I was. Here in the Western world, in the United States, we tend to think of adoption as a man and a wife legally taking some child from an orphanage or from some other institution or whatever that wasn't born of our flesh and blood, but we take them in and we legally make them our child, giving them our last name and writing them down in the book to be an inheritor of our things when we die. I mean, it's a legal transaction that makes them our child. And that is one form of adoption, but that is not exactly what this is talking about here. This right here, the spirit of adoption, the word adoption here, based on the context of the time, the Romans and or the Jews and they all had a similar thing here, and it could be defined as son placement, or if you want, child placement, but son placement ultimately in the context here. So it means that we receive the spirit of the Son in us, and we are positioned, put in the family of God Himself, in a position to operate in His authority as a joint heir, is what we discover here in a few more verses I hadn't read yet. But look with me in Galatians. The Apostle Paul touches on this in the Galatian letter also. We have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry out, "Abba, Father." So this is not just being birthed into the family of God. This is not just about some legal transaction that has taken place because of the cross. It is legal. I mean, it's eternally significant, but it is not just a legal piece of paperwork. It's not that. It's an actual placement as a full heir into what God has promised us. Listen to this. Galatians 4, starting in verse 1, I'm just going to read a few verses here. "Now I say, as long as the heir is a child, he does not differ at all from a slave, although he is owner of everything. But he is under guardians and managers until the date set by the Father. So also we, while we were children, were held in bondage under the elemental things of the world." See, that be that we have not received the spirit of bondage to fear, slavery to fear. See, but we were held in bondage under that. Galatians 4:4, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that He might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.'" There it is again, same language. "Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God." Wow. So the letter to the Romans, and I find this is a significant point to get a hold of, that the Apostle Paul's letters are generally written in this fashion. He starts us out in one place and he walks us to another. It's not just a random jumbled bits of information that he decides to spew onto the page. He's walking us through, helping us to see and understand the mind of God and what He's really done for us through the cross, through Christ. So in Romans 6, I don't want to beat this up too much, but in Romans 6, it says we were a slave to sin and now we're a slave to righteousness. In Romans 7, it says we were married to this one husband, but through Christ we have died to that old union so that we could be joined to another who is Christ, so that we might bear fruit for God. And then in Romans 8, we now see that we have received a specific spirit of son placement, and we have actually become an heir. So we have gone from slave to an heir, slave to a family member, slave to a son. And that is so important because God Himself is our Father. He is our Father. He's not just our slave boss or our righteous master, which He is our righteous master, but He's not just that. He's our master, but He's our Father. So the spirit of adoption, the spirit of Christ within us, the Son of God in us, cries out from within us, Abba, Father. And we join Him in that. Romans 8:16, the Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God. So the Spirit of God in us, joined now to this resurrected, newly enlivened human spirit that we have. I don't ever want to not be excited about that. The Holy Spirit, God Himself, Christ in you, is the hope of glory. That Spirit testifies with our spirit, assures us that we are in fact children of God. Now, I, for one, am extremely excited about that because, there's always somebody that can out-argue or talk you out of things. There's always someone more manipulative or smarter or more intellectual or conniving or tricky than you. But the news here is saying that the very Spirit of God in you is assuring you, testifying within you that you are a child of God. So there's no heady intellectual books or seminars or atheistic thinking or whatever that can change that, because it can't. The Spirit of God is the one that is convincing you. Romans 8:17, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, so that we may also be glorified with Him. Wow. So, yes, we're children. The Spirit in us testifies and assures us we're His children, which makes us heirs, joint heirs, co-heirs with Christ. That means everything that He seeks or He is set to inherit, we too are set to inherit. I heard someone say one time that we don't look too much into our past, and we don't see that as who we are. Because on the cross, that thing was crucified with Christ and buried and raised back. So now what we do is we look at Christ and we say, His past is our past and His future is our future, because we are one with Him. We don't have two separate pasts. We don't have two separate anythings. We are one with Him. 1 Corinthians 6:17 says that he that is joined to the Lord is one spirit. I think that may be one of the most quoted verses I quote, because it is so amazing, astounding, and encouraging and comforting to know that when we've received Christ, the very Spirit of God Himself joined Himself to our human spirit and testifies in our spirit that we are children of God. And by that same Spirit, we, being joined to Christ, cry out, Abba, Father. When we're in trouble, when we're tempted to go back to an old system, old pattern, when the flesh is just craving something we know that God forbids, we cry out, Abba, Father. And that's part of the suffering, because it says, that if we're children, we're heirs and heirs of God, and fellow or co-heirs or joint heirs, depending on your translation, with Christ. If we suffer with Him, we'll also be glorified with Him. So part of the suffering is just everyday pulls on our flesh, pulls on our desires for comfort and pleasure that maybe God is saying no to us about. There's all kinds of suffering. There's suffering of being accused by the enemy. There's suffering of being misunderstood. There's suffering of just simply standing up for the truth when everyone else is caving in. And there's little nagging sufferings all throughout the day where we say no to the flesh. We say, no, that's not who I am anymore. Me and Christ are one in my spirit, and I don't have to go for that anymore. I don't have to. And it will be a suffering. You know, a friend of mine, Brian Cote, he says this. He says, walking in the Spirit or living in the Spirit is easy. It's excruciating at times, but it's easy. And I think that says it all right there. But Romans 8:18 tells us this. We'll end with this verse today. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed in us. No matter how much the suffering of right now is, it has no comparison to the glory that's going to be revealed. I want to show you something here. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, I've forgotten where I'm going in my Bible here. 2 Corinthians 4, amazing chapter. The Apostle Paul says, he describes for us all kinds of suffering. He says that we're afflicted but not crushed, perplexed but not despairing, persecuted but not forsaken, struck down but not destroyed, always carrying about, 2 Corinthians 4:10, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. So the life of Jesus, God's plan is the life of Jesus would be revealed, manifest in your body, your flesh body, your human body. That's His plan. For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death works in us, but life in you. Wow. Eventually, I would just read this whole chapter if I could, but I don't want to get too far away. All right, so in Romans 8:18 tells us the present sufferings, the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that will be revealed in us. And that's what Paul's telling us also. 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17 and 18, I'll leave you with this. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Oh my gosh, see, we are spirit beings walking in God's Spirit, believing for the spiritual truths that God has left us in His Word and is manifesting by His Spirit. And we recognize these temporary, outward, bodily sufferings are that. They're temporary, and they're actually working for us and not against us. And the way they work for us is that the more we have pressure and temptation and pulls and tugs, accusations, and all kinds of other things going on in the natural, the more it drives us to trust Him in the Spirit. Walking in the Spirit can be excruciating, but it is the only way. It's the only way. It's the prescribed way. Galatians 5 tells us that if we walk in the Spirit, we will not fulfill the lust of the flesh, which is full of suffering. All right, I think I've beaten this long enough. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you will join me on the next Louie file as we pick up. Where are we going to pick up? It's going to be in Romans 8, verse 19 on the next video. I'll see you then.